Hi, everybody. Welcome. We're so glad that you decided to join. Whether you are having a late lunch or an early lunch, it is going to be a really good time. We're going to wait for a few more people to trickle in, but just in case you're not sure what classroom you stopped in, we're going to be talking about the economic consequences and the generational impact of the digital divide. And so I'm really excited to not only be able to share the trade secrets of the research that I've been doing all year, and based on your text, LinkedIn messages and emails, you've been wondering. So this is going to be a preview to the paper that I'll have published in May, and definitely a preview to some more work to come. But I'm really excited to be able to share this work not only on a TAPP platform, but to also be able to cross-pollinate platforms with so many of the people that I talk to, and being able to do this research, and other academic institutions, other scholars who are asking really hard questions but haven't necessarily gone public with them yet. I'm really excited to be able to share this with you today. So before we get started with my PowerPoint presentation, I do want you to get a chance to meet one of my most brilliant colleagues that I couldn't imagine doing this day without her. And so for those of you who are not familiar with her work, I'm going to let Catherine DeWitt tell you a little bit about the work that she does at the Pew Charitable Trust. She is one of my broadband sisters, a pioneer in the state broadband work, and really a person who asks me hard questions all the time. So I thought, what better platform than to talk about it on my research, and I'm really excited that she'll get to talk a little bit about her work first.
Well, thanks, Francella. Doing what you do best, which is lifting other people up and highlighting and celebrating their work, usually when they're there to celebrate yours. Thank you so much for inviting me here today to ask you questions at the end of your research review. Hello, everyone. I'm the project director for the Broadband Access Initiative at the Pew Charitable Trusts. For those of you who are not familiar with Pew, we're a nonprofit, nonpartisan research institution. Me and all of my colleagues, we do research on complex policy challenges and work to find solutions, and then work with lawmakers at every level of government, every branch of government, to help implement those solutions. And of course, well, you're all here, so you may or may not know that broadband is one of the most challenging issues facing our nation today. The digital divide, not only from understanding why it exists, but really how do we solve it, and how do we make sure that we are solving it in such a way that it that we don't experience long-term economic ramifications in it, from it, and people are able to use it to improve their lives down the road. And which is why I'm so excited that Francella is doing this research, and why I'm so excited to work with her in general. She's someone who always focuses on the impact that her work will have on communities, impact on real people. She herself is not afraid to ask hard questions, which you can have no better compliment of a researcher. So for those of you who have had the opportunity to study with her and learn from her in the last year, that's awesome. So continue learning from her and using her as a resource, as I do and as many of my colleagues do in the field. So I will see all of you in a bit. Please put your questions in the Q&A box. I will be reviewing those after Francella's presentation, and I'll talk to all of you in about 40 minutes.
Thank you so much, Catherine. And I do want to let everybody know, those of you who are joining, feel free to drop your name and your institution or your hometown in the chat. We'd love to hear from you. Welcome, Kevin and Bert and other people who are trickling in. I am going to share my screen just to show you a slideshow presentation, and this is also going to be sprinkled in with videos. First, just to tell you a little bit about my fellowship, I am doing a technology and public purpose fellowship here at Harvard Kennedy School, specifically in the Belfer Center. And for those of you who are not familiar with all of the luminaries behind the scenes, I did want to start by saying a big thank you to the people who make the TAPP program go around. And so starting with Secretary Carter, Amritha, the program director, Karen, who we work with on a daily basis, Henry, who makes things happen behind the scenes, and then also my non-resident advisor, Emily, who is just, was probably one of the first people to encourage me not just to come here with hard questions, but to be able to see beyond where I stand. I also wanted to make sure to include a picture of my brilliant resident research assistant. Catherine Darren is a Massachusetts native, University of Pennsylvania graduate, trained in New York City government, and I am convinced will eventually be the governor of Massachusetts. So I wanted to make sure, in case anybody from the HKS campus sees her around, that you got to see her picture and put a name to a face, because so much of the number crunching and the data analysis is really, I just appreciated being able to do it with her. Moving on to hear a little bit about people that you'll hear from throughout this presentation. First, for those of you who are not familiar with Professor Jason Furman, who is actually used to be an economic advisor in the Obama administration here on Harvard's campus. He is a professor in 2 different departments in the Kennedy School, as well as arts and sciences. Then you'll also hear from former Commissioner Mignon Clyburn. I will tell you, just as background, about 5 years ago, it was my second meeting at the FCC headquarters. I walked into her office back then. I believe it was Claude Aiken was one of her advisors, and also Elisa Valentine. And we sat down on the couch. We were talking about Lifeline, a low-income program. And one of the first things that she said that resonated with me was that we needed to be able to make the economic case for connecting every single person in the United States, even the most disenfranchised people. That question lingered with me and actually was part of the premise of my proposal to get here to Harvard. And then finally, Dean Bhaskar Chakravorti. I'm not really sure why the universe didn't bring us together sooner, but I am convinced that this was actually the first of several collaborations. He is somebody that I think of a little bit of like the Beyonce or Serena Williams of this field, who is thinking about some of the same things that I'm thinking about, but has way more expertise and lots of time under his belt tenure under his belt working on this. So I was really excited to be able to tap into his brain power. So moving on to tell you a little bit about my work, I will tell you I'm just going to be able to go over a couple of my main research findings of my paper that's coming out in May. I won't be able to go into all of them in detail, but I thought let's go ahead and start with one of the ones that was the most difficult conclusions, because there were a lot of tentacles to be able to peel apart to get here. But one of my first research findings was when we're talking about broadband and really trying to understand the problem. There's a section of my paper that really talks about how past is prologue. And it's really important that we aren't just focused on the problems that we're trying to solve today. It's important that as we try to dismantle them, we understand what was the root cause of some of the problems. And so in order to do that analysis, we needed to really go back and scrub how telephone regulations influenced broadband regulations in the landscape, and also how that has made an indelible mark that we are still fighting those demons while trying to fund new and complicated problems. So one of my first conclusions was that monopolistic principles from the telephone era laid the foundation for limited competition and lopsided power dynamics in the broadband landscape. So how did I get there? So I wanted to make sure to walk you through an actual timeline so that you got a chance to actually see how far back we went. And so going back to around 1878, Alexander Graham Bell was great because he got the patent first. He beat out Elijah Gray for turning in the paperwork, and so be it. We are thinking about an entirely new era of connectivity that goes beyond telegraph. Telephone was different in that it was the first technology that was actually supposed to get into every single person's home. So when we think about how essentially this turned into a regulated monopoly for over 40 years, you have to start with the root of it was that it was a series of mergers between telephone entities and also telegraphs that created one of the first and largest telephone corporations. And so through that, for the next essentially 40 years and change until the FCC is created by the Communications Act. That Communications Act not only created the Federal Communications Commission, but that agency was actually named to regulate what everyone acknowledged was a monopoly. And one of the things that I do touch on in my paper is talking about why was telephone treated differently than oil monopolies that were being broken up, railroad monopolies that were being disrupted. Why was telephone different? And one of the things that came to light maybe about 4 months into this was I was trying to find out, where did this universal service phraseology come from? I really didn't know. It kept appearing not only in the Communications Act of 1934, it's going to resurface in the Communications Act of 1996. But one thing that I stumbled upon was the actual slogan of the American Telegraph and Telephone Company was about one policy, one system, universal service. And so when you unpeel that, there was actually acquiescence from the government to say, yeah, we think that private sector can do this better. We are okay with it being a regulated monopoly as long as you are putting consumers first. And one of the important parts of the company slogan was actually about putting customers first, even at the expense of profits. So I thought that that was an interesting revelation, because it was something that had so much widespread support, it was actually adopted into communications code. And so here we have the first universal service agreement that relates to telecom and technology. And so that piece is going to stick with us for over a century. Fast forward to 1993, when the World Wide Web gets introduced into people's homes. When we think about, there was actually another company that was actually the first one to bring internet into people's homes. But when we think about those dial-up connections, again, it's important to remember that those dial-up connections were actually based on telephone lines. And so if anybody remembers back in the day when you would sign up, log on for your internet, and essentially you could use at least at my house, you could use the phone or you could use internet, but you couldn't use both at the same time. Again, those things matter in the background, because how we regulated telephone is going to make an imprint on how we regulate broadband as it is born of that technology. So it's 1996. We have a new version of the Communications Act, which again adopts the universal service principles. It provides the framework for the FCC to eventually say broadband should also be treated with that universal service mandate, and also funding through programs like, for example, Lifeline, which will come later, but essentially is going to be the only federal broadband subsidy for years. But in the meantime, after 1996, 2 years later, the NTIA publishes this report. And one of the things that I loved about this report, it was a follow-up to the report on the haves and the have-nots. One thing I loved about it was, if you read this report, it actually quoted the digital divide in quotes. And so it was interesting for them to have their finger on it, but it was still something that wasn't socialized just yet. And so in my paper, I do talk a little bit about the definitions of the digital divide, but it's important that even in 1998, the federal government acknowledged that it was a problem. So fast forward to 2010, the Federal Communications Commission, the agency of jurisdiction over broadband, produces the National Broadband Plan. One of the things that's important in that broadband plan, it's a beautiful outline of what could be possible and all the possibilities that could be unlocked with connectivity. And one of the things that's important in there is that it actually says, we have not realized the potential of what broadband and having a highly connected populace could do for the United States, not just for a few, but for everyone. And so it makes the case for universal connectivity. 9 years later, you're actually going to see something that's going to disrupt the thinking of who is connected. And it's a moment that even I remember the work that we were doing on broadband. I remember when the Microsoft report came out saying that approximately 1/3 of the United States did not use broadband at 25.3 benchmark speeds. For people who aren't familiar with broadband, the FCC set the 25.3 megabits per second benchmark back in 2015. By 2019, over 4 years later, it's saying that still, after you've made a national plan, you know that the digital divide is a problem. We know that it actually benefits everyone to be connected. We still have 1/3 of the United States that isn't connected. And so what was important about that moment is that the same year the Microsoft study comes out is the same year that the FCC is saying that it's only 21 million households that are struggling with it. The reason why that delta makes a huge difference is because even if the answer is somewhere in between, we aren't necessarily grappling with the same problem. And so when we're thinking about access at the time, it's still being measured by whether or not you have proximity to digital infrastructure, not whether you can use it. But here, a private study comes in and says, hold on a second, what difference does it make if it's nearby? If you can't afford it, you can't adopt it, you can't actually benefit from technology. So when I was doing some of my research, I wanted to point out something that I also found, which was extremely interesting. I found several articles that actually talked about telephone service in the same way that we talk about broadband today. It was cited for being able to help enhance healthcare, to improve emergency services, specifically policing and emergency response. It was supposed to enable grassroots advocacy and further democracy by also helping people get out the vote. It was supposed to help distribute public information in faster ways for people who were just relying on the daily newspaper, and also as a method to combat misinformation. It was also seen as an opportunity to create jobs and improve government functions. So when we're talking about this, I always want to remind us that we're facing some of the same questions that we were facing decades ago. But I think sometimes we're not sure about our values and what exactly we see as the solution. So I decided to pose this question first to Dean Chakravorti, and I asked him to tell us about what exactly is a digital divide. One of the reasons why this was a really interesting answer was because of the fact that he sees it as a multidimensional problem.
Well, I think the answer to that question is complicated. It's complicated by the fact that when we say digital, one natural question to ask is, what does that really mean? And we know that the divide suggests that different people experience the digital economy, the digital ecosystems in different ways. Some are on the quote-unquote right side of the divide and others on the wrong side of the divide. The way I sort of think about the digital divide is in sort of three simple terms. One is, are people using the digital ecosystem at speeds and at a level of quality that gives them access to the primary applications that that is coming through the internet? And do people have sufficient access? And can they actually afford that access? So combination of that leads to usage. So that's kind of part one. Part two is, even if you do have access and you can afford it and you are getting the internet in all its glory, are you using that information in a way that is constructive, that's productive, that is improving your life? Or is it possibly leading to the dark tunnel of misinformation, disinformation, wrong information, and potentially narrowing of your horizons? And the third part of the digital divide is not just what's in front of us or what's been behind us, but really what's around the corner. Because as we know, digital is essentially a constantly moving space. So the question to me that's important about the digital divide is also forward-looking. Are these emerging technologies shaping up in ways that are leveling the playing field, or is it potentially exacerbating the inequities and injustice and differences that have been handed to us historically?
So moving on to that, later in this conversation, another piece comes up. And I asked him, as we were talking about the value of having a highly connected population, we moved on to a different question. And then he actually came back and said, hold on a second, I want to revisit whether or not broadband should be a utility. I'll share that now.
I'd just like to address this issue of whether it should be a public utility or not, because I do think there is still room for a debate and a discussion on this topic. So for all the reasons you mentioned, the broadband access should be a public utility because it's essential for not just watching Netflix in the evening, but it's for working at home or attending school during the day, or doing a telehealth consultation during any time of the day or night. Now, there is an argument to be made that if you were to convert something that was being provided by the private market to a public utility, that might degrade the quality of the service, because the history of public utilities has been that they are not as innovative and not as dynamic as the private sector, because they lack the incentives. And that's the argument that's been made to not make the broadband industry, the broadband providing industry, public utility. Now, I think there's a healthy discussion to be had about that. The place where I fall on this debate affordable broadband. So if the direction is public utility, if that's the organization structure, then I would go for it. So I think there's a trade-off involved in going from private to public or a public utility. I feel a lot of the innovations in broadband access, we have much of that under our belt, and now I prefer to have it more evenly distributed across the entire public.
And that was definitely a moment for me where I hadn't thought about it that way and thought that it was worth sharing. And I moved on to asking Commissioner Clyburn a question that I didn't want to lead her, and especially considering that she had years of experience at the agency. I did wonder, in all of our talk about how the digital divide is measured and the fact that the FCC focuses on access, did they have enough information to properly exact remedies?
There's no system that's perfect. I have a lot of respect and love for the Federal Communications Commission. Spent 8.5 years of my professional life there. I would defend it to the end. One of the things that they need to do better is to have better data and to make sure that that data that they have that they use has been peer reviewed. And when I say peer reviewed, I mean a broad set of peers. Peer review is not taking the word of an incumbent and saying this is what we cover, or accept the fact that a coverage area just means the full air quotes the ability or the proximity to serve. It does not mean that the big house is connected and all of those in the little farm homes down the road have no access. That's not being connected. So again, incomplete data in, incomplete results out. And so again, all of us legislatively, from a regulatory point of view, from a private industry, have been mutually and negatively complicit in creating a very incomplete picture of what is and who has. And we have been fixated on building, and they will come, as opposed to what are the tools they need to be connected to justify the bill.
I was really excited to be able to get her insights. And that brings me to my second major finding. And that is that broadband access and adoption in the richest and poorest states showed a direct correlation between a household's low income status and their barriers to adoption. The race and income levels of the most disconnected populations were remarkably similar, regardless of the geography. So I'll walk you through some of the numbers that we looked at. And in particular, I think that it's important that I didn't want to walk into this work with conclusions about who is disconnected. I wanted to make sure that we actually looked state by state and lined up what are the most high income states versus the low income states. And is it really true that nationwide, it tends to be people that are already in the minority are the people who struggle with access? So you'll see on the x-axis, we have the median household income. So if you go down to the left side of it, you're going to see low income here at around $20,000 per household. And you're going to see the higher income here. And I do want to point out that District of Columbia is the highest income of the territories and states. On the y-axis, we have the percentage of households that have minimum access to broadband. And again, you just heard how access is measured. It's about you having proximity to the digital infrastructure. When we look at the analysis, if you look here concentrated in this top right corner of the map, you will see that without exception, the highest income states are among the most connected, or at least the most with the highest access to broadband. And the lower income states are the ones that have inferior access to broadband, with Puerto Rico being a glaring example of where people do not have access and face barriers because of their low income status. Moving on to actually look at it in a different way. So what we did, again, on the x-axis, we're still dealing with the states, the 10 highest and lowest states and territories on the x-axis on the bottom. And then here, this is talking about broadband access. So when you look at the gray numbers, this is talking about, according to the FCC, exactly how many households in that state have access. So you'll see in the higher income states, you tend to have almost ubiquitous access in between, on average, 90 to 90, anywhere from 98 to 99%, with Alaska being an exception. And then it becomes a little bit more shaky when we get into the low income states. Looking at that layered with there are people who are actually adopting. So the green number is actually talking about who is actually subscribing to broadband. So when we look at this, again, in Puerto Rico, according to the FCC, 100% of the households have access. And then when you look at it compared to the numbers, it also says that only 43% of them actually have an at-home connection. Look at Mississippi, only 60% of the low 80% that have access actually have an in-home connection. Arkansas, only 65% of the 81%. So when we look at this, the delta in between who has access is just as problematic as this number in between 80 and 100, or 82 and 100. So when we actually then dig into, okay, so who's disconnected? We know that's the percentage of people statewide. How do we actually know who it is disparately impacting? So when we actually went and looked to break down the numbers to find out this by looking at the demographics of the most disconnected households, one of the places was the District of Columbia, where it was so lopsided that it was startling. So approximately in households that identify as white Americans, only 5 people did not have broadband access at home, whereas the DC residents that identified as Black or African American, approximately 39% of them were struggling with access. Again, if we were to look at numbers like, for example, in 13% in Hawaii, households that are saying that it's only 13% of them that are facing serious barriers to broadband access. But when you look at the Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander, 40% of them are struggling. So we wanted to be able to actually look at the numbers to find out, what does it tell you when you actually look at that correlation between the richest and the poorest states? Some of the things that were takeaways that were unequivocal, didn't matter how we ran the numbers, was that the lack of broadband adoption was concentrated in low-income households. And that was a trend that was repeated over and over again. It didn't matter the way that we sliced the numbers. Also, Indigenous, Black or African American and Hispanic or Latino households were substantially at higher rates struggling with barriers to adoption. Also, one thing that was an interesting corollary was the fact that in places, in households that they didn't have access to broadband, or at least an in-home connection, we also saw high unemployment rates and also high rates of people who were not in the labor force. So that means that you are not even looking. And then finally, another key takeaway when we're talking about telehealth outcomes is that in houses where people did not have reliable broadband adoption, they were more likely to be uninsured. So again, these are things that we were looking at the highest and the lowest income states to find out, what did we learn? And so we learned that essentially low and middle income Americans experience significant limitations on their earning power, and also being able to develop the net assets needed to create intergenerational wealth. And when they have better access to digital citizenship, meaning that they have access, they have adoption, they have the tools to adopt and the skills to benefit from technology, it boosts their educational options, their economic resilience, their healthcare options in a rapidly changing digital economy. And something that I want to make sure that I don't gloss over when I talk about specifically here economic resilience, I do want to point out that on average, the American family on average only has approximately $3,500 in their bank account. So this is about making sure that people have durability in the workforce, that they can afford to look for a new job without being completely devastated by a month or two of being out of work. So I wanted to give people a picture because I don't want to make assumptions that people know what these numbers look like when you actually think about, okay, well, what does it mean to make $15 an hour, or maybe to have a salary at around $70,000 a year, or maybe you graduate, you make $104,000 a year in some markets. What does that actually look like over your terms in the workforce? So I want to give a few backgrounds on assumptions. On average, people who are in highly connected places, who have a lot of economic mobility and job options, on average, the average American is actually going to have 11 to 12 jobs over the course of your time in the workforce. And specifically, the higher up you are on the income ladder, the later you actually join the workforce. So where we have low income families, on average, you're joining the workforce as a part-time employee sooner. So you have longer times in the workforce, and you also don't have as many retirement options. So for simplicity, just for illustration, I wanted to show what does it look like over 40 years in the workforce if we just said, this is how much these people make their starting salary. They make a 3% increase without exception every single year for being a good employee. And then also, aside from that, they work 52 weeks out of the year. So when we have someone who starts at minimum wage, $15 per hour, they're on average making around $31,000 a year. They're here in this green curve. When they make around $72,000 per year in their salary, that breaks down to around roughly $35 an hour. They're here in the center at this purple line. And then when you look at the employee who starts at the six-figure salary at $104,000, this breaks down to around $50 per year. I wanted to point this out because even over that 40 years, at first, it doesn't seem like they start that far apart. But what happens is that over time, this delta becomes even wider and wider and wider. And that is what adds to the income inequality and separation of wealth, because people who start at low to mid incomes can never catch up. They actually have to have something that actually interrupts that cycle or a boost in skills. So I wanted to get thoughts from Professor Furman as an economic scholar, what his thoughts were on how generational wealth and digital divide intersect.
I mean, this is one of the areas where it would both contribute to higher inequality and lower economic growth if digital access is not improved. And when you have many years in a row of lower income, you're going to have lower wealth. When you have lower wealth, your children are going to have less opportunity. They're going to have less wealth and the like. So inequality is one of these things that is self-perpetuating, because when there's more inequality in a given moment, because some people have more access to income producing streams, that tends to lead to less opportunity for the next generation, whether it's through education or through wealth itself.
So we had moved on to a different question, and Professor Perman came back to a piece that was actually augmented something that he just said when he was talking about the intersections. And he mentioned something that at the end, he called it a virtuous or a vicious cycle.
Yeah, it's your earnings. I have not seen a systematic statistical study of this question for the year 2020, 2021, and certainly no one's done one for the year 2022. But if you look before the pandemic, there was a premium to people who were digitally connected in terms of their ability to find a job, their ability to have training for a job. What my guess is has gone up by leaps and bounds is that doing your job increasingly is dependent not just on a connection that enables you to return an email late at night, but on a connection that enables you to get on a high quality Zoom call that you're not being interrupted, moving in and out of at night as well. And so, here it's purely speculative, but the speculation is very plausible that what we saw in the data before, that was enough to convince me this was an important issue before, has to be just much, much more. And then, earnings turn into wealth, and wealth turns into the ability to have broadband access, and broadband access turns into earnings, which turns into wealth, which turns into the ability to have access. So there's a real spiral that can be a virtuous one, or can be a vicious one, depending on which side of it you're on.
It was really great to be able to just hear his thoughts on it. And so I got into a conversation with Dean Chakravorti to get his take on where he sees income inequality and the digital divide intersect. And he had a really great way of framing the urgency of this question.
Because every study, including ours, only gets to the point of being able to show that, look, there's a relationship, there's a correlation, and the correlation is repeated no matter where you go. And intuitively, you kind of get it. You can see that there is a causation, in both directions. So if you are low income, you are likely to also have low access to high-speed internet. It makes sense because high-speed internet is expensive. And if you're low income, you only have so much money that you're going to spend on different things. And so you're going to say, I don't want that expensive service. And the fact that you don't have that expensive service also means that you can't interview for jobs that are likely to be higher paying. Many of those jobs are knowledge jobs, and many of those knowledge jobs these days, the interviews are happening on Zoom. And a lot of the work is being done on video conferences. If you don't have that access, boom, you don't get that job. So then it essentially becomes a self-reinforcing cycle. And we've seen this. And now the other problem, of course, is that it also hops generations. So it's not just the adult who's experiencing low income and then gets into the cycle of low income, low connectivity, which then feeds low income. Their children are already in underfunded school districts. And their children, at least over the course of the last 2 years, were sitting at home attending school on poor internet connections and sometimes no internet connections. And they had to kind of go to the public library or sit outside the public library and piggyback on free Wi-Fi in order to attend a class or download homework. So, and we've seen the effects of this over the course of the pandemic. And sadly, the disproportionate effect is felt by households of color and by rural households, but just the sheer numbers are in the areas which are the poorer neighborhoods in the larger metropolitan areas. There's about a 12 to 14% gap between white households and Black and brown households in terms of the access to high-speed internet. And that is a shocking state of affairs.
So I went in pursuit of some of the comments that Dean Chakravorti mentioned, and I wanted to make sure that I actually pulled the numbers on that. And so just to give people specific examples, in general, white households tend to have 8 times the wealth of Black and brown households. White households also benefit from higher salaries and more expansive investment opportunities. And most importantly, when we are talking about wealth in the United States, the majority of US households, their intergenerational wealth is based on their ability to own a home. And in general, there's only around 44% of people who will be renters for their life cycles. Most of those people are Black and brown. And so when we talk about them not even being able to achieve home ownership, that is something with generational consequences. So I am going to skip over just a few of my other findings because I do want to make sure that we wrap up on time. And I want to be able to get, even if it's just a short clip, in to talk about how essentially one of the things that I set out to prove was the fact that when we talk about the digital divide as it only affects the households that are disconnected, it excuses us from having to take ownership of the issue as if we are not also affected as connected people. And so one of the things I was able to show was that digital inequities impose a cost that is shared between connected and disconnected households. And specifically, if we use consumer-focused policies, strategic investments, and sustainable partnerships, that could easily be reversed. So I am going to fast forward to be able to just hear a few comments. Specifically, I will start with Professor Furman's just because his notes were really concise.
Yeah, I mean, connectivity is the ultimate network good. And so its value, to me personally, goes up the more other people are connected. And so when you have a network good, the loss is not just to the person who's excluded, it's to everyone that can access them, that they can't contribute to. And ultimately that can be expressed in terms of economic growth, or just the well-being even of connected people is lower because so many people are disconnected.
And so because I see there are so many questions that might be in the chat because I haven't been able to open it, but I did want to make sure just to close with the final point that when I set out to do this research, it wasn't with blame or shame about whether it was government inaction or marketplace conditions or who were bad actors. I think my goal was just to sort out what can we actually do about this? And so I went to a presentation a few weeks ago, and this statement, there were two separate statements that really resonated with me, and really thinking about we have the opportunities to create the connected world that we want. And even if tech isn't the answer, we know that it's an enabler, and it's also something that gives people economic power, which changes their educational, health, and overall well-being. So I'm really excited to have Catherine ask me lots of questions, and I want to make sure that I get to those questions in the chat. But again, I just thank you for being on the journey with me, and I'm really excited about being able to continue this work.
All right. Thank you so much, Francella. I'm so excited to dig into these questions and just to read and reread the paper. First questions, of course, with group of researchers on here. One, will the slides be publicly available?
Oh, sure. I could do that. Yeah,
great. There we go.
Yeah, I hadn't planned on it, but I could definitely do that. I could do that. And it also has like links to obviously pieces of the interviews that I didn't get to.
Yeah, great. And then second, there was a question about where you sourced the data from in your presentation.
So some of it is sourced from Federal Communications Commission, American Community Survey, and all of that is underneath. So when I do share the slides, you'll actually see the actual years that we used. And then also in the report, some of these slides are actually going to appear as is in my report.
Okay, perfect. Alrighty, so we've got some shy folks here. So people, please keep putting questions in the Q&A box. But in the meantime, I will start asking you questions myself.
Okay.
Okay, so one of the things that really struck me as I was reading your research and also as you were presenting it today was just the kind of lack of research also that's out in this field on this issue. So can you talk a little bit about any challenges you ran into as you were going through this exercise, whether it was data gaps, just what was missing? What is the field missing?
One of the things that was probably the first thing that attracted me to it was that it worries me when we talk about the digital divide, framing it with the pandemic. I think that it's important for us to take specific lessons that we learned from the pandemic. I think that the reality is the pandemic accelerated a march towards digitization that was happening slowly in some context, but also was accelerated. And then we had to deal with the fallout of that when everybody wasn't prepared. But when we talk about this issue, for me, sometimes pieces of it become politicized. And the reality is that the most disconnected people are also facing very serious economic barriers that affects not only their housing, their education, their other prospects for wellness, but their political clout. Because I think that if you can make this an issue and shame people into performance, that's wonderful. But what happens when you can't get on those platforms where people are having that public dialogue, when they are maybe shaming their elected official on Twitter, showing up in a town hall meeting, wherever that forum is for you? there's an assumption that everyone has equal access, and that's just not true. So I felt like if I could focus on the numbers, if we could focus on how this actually affects people, it would change the way that we approach the solution.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. All right, thank you people for putting questions in. All right, we have had a flood. Okay, so first, were you able to explore the digital divide across other geographical contexts?
Yeah. Oh, so the research focused specifically on those 20 states and territories. And then there were a couple of them that I do expand on in my paper, like Mississippi, DC, New Mexico. And I think there might be a few others that I did mention. Yeah. I did shout out a couple of pieces of research from like New York City, Tennessee, places like that. But there are a few that didn't make the paper, but I did want to make sure that I even talked about some of the statistics. One of the things that was tugging at me was about affordability. And so two of the questions that I feel like we never, are able to pin down: what's affordable and what kind of speeds do you need? There's always like a very elusive question. And so one of the things that I thought about was that when I was reading some of the material on this state has this percentage of people who have access to a plan that's $60 or less, my issue was, okay, well, what does that really mean? Because when you are talking to highly connected and also very affluent populations, to them, $60 is like their Starbucks budget for the month, right? So I was like, okay, well, let me break this down to what this means. So if you're in the state of Kentucky, and we're talking about you have access to an affordable plan, let's just say that on average, number one, statewide, over 250,000 people do not have access to an affordable, to baseline 25/3 speeds. And then also over 500,000 people do not have access, they only have one ISP in their area. So we have a monopoly issue where you don't have a lot of choice. And then also if you do have a provider even nearby. So then I was like, well, only around 39% of the people have access to a plan that's less than $60 a month. So if you make on average $50,000 a year, that means that after taxes, let's say you get to keep 70% of your money, you're at around $35,489 a year after taxes, which means in your bank account, you're going to get around $2,957 per month. After you pay the average rent in the state of Kentucky, that means you have $2,277 to budget for you and your household, and you haven't eaten anything yet. And so I want to make sure that when people talk about just like, oh, it's just $60 a month, the problem is that if you only make that and you can't afford to be sick, you're struggling with food. And I also want to make sure some of those people do not qualify on the poverty line for health subsidies or housing subsidies. This is the working poor. So these are populations that we're missing. So I feel like some of the things that didn't quite make the report were still important. I just had to make some hard decisions.
I think that sounds like a great opportunity for others to build on this research.
So yes, please and thank you to that.
Which is actually one of the questions that is in the chat, which is how can others who are either really concerned about this issue leverage this work, or how can others, what are other areas of research that folks can build, can use this as, how can others use this as a foundation for future research? There we go.
There are several pieces that I hope that people follow up on, especially when we're talking about like, making this a part of when we're even estimating what do people need in their households, that they need electricity, they need clean water, they need broadband connection, some sort of Wi-Fi connectivity. I think it's important for us to talk about that as a necessity, because especially when even baseline access to get any sort of like government services to be able to do a lot of things that might be in your hometown, it starts with an email. And so the thing is, it's kind of like if we're requiring people to be able to speak that language on this platform, then we should make sure that everyone has access to that platform. Secondly, I just didn't get enough time to do the work that I wanted to do on financial inclusion. Financial inclusion is one of those things that I feel like, especially when we talk about public service, at the heart of the people who are in the greatest need, when we talk about food, housing, and other things, are cycles of poverty. And so if we can find ways to give people economic mobility and options, and also thinking about the fact that the most disconnected people are limited by geography in a way that the rest of us are not. And so think about that. If you can't, I could be doing work from anywhere. I have my phone, I have my laptop, I can get on my iPad. If you don't have connectivity, that means you have to go in person. That means you might have to take a bus. You might have to, put together money for gas. You have different obstacles. And so you're limited by geography in a completely different way that I think we ignore in these conversations. And then also thinking about how this affects people, especially when we talk about, number one, financial inclusion and like the unbanked populations. I think about the fact that over 5 to 6% of the United States is still unbanked or underbanked. That includes people in rural areas where credit unions and small banks have been on the decline for the past 10 years. So when we talk about financial inclusion, that is something that provides a roadmap to all of these other things that we want and consider to make us prosperous. So that's something that I think when we can give people economic freedom, there's a whole variety of choices and doors that open. And then finally, for us not to otherize this issue, I think that sometimes when people see me doing research or, I'll say something that the way it disparately impacts people. And I think people vastly underestimate what I'm thinking when they think I'm walking in to talk about minorities, because it doesn't cross their mind that I could have a good idea for humankind. And I think that, quite frankly, it shouldn't be that minorities have to be pointing that out. This is something that has a collective cost. And because of that, we should all be thinking about when you rise, I rise. And so if my neighbor's connected and there are higher salaries in my community, we all benefit. And so one of the things that I do point out at the end of my paper was an example of when a Whole Foods or a Trader Joe's or an Amazon warehouse opens in someone's neighborhood, I don't actually need to walk through the front door to receive a benefit. So everybody in the community benefits, even if I never use that service. And we all have better access to whether it's tax reductions or better community services, whether it's having more community building and connectivity, like people feeling connected to each other because you live longer. And so these are little things that I think sometimes we just don't have time to dig into the details.
Mm-hmm. No, I think you're completely right. And I want to come back to this question on social return on investment and kind of this concept of like the network good. But before we do, I do feel like you brought up a really good point. And Joshua Williams asked a question kind of getting at this in the Q&A, which is, how are you going to share this research directly with the communities that are impacted by the digital divides? Breaking down those barriers between, those of us talking about it and the people actually affected by it.
Okay, so number one, Joshua Williams, if that is an invite to your hometown, I will be there. And so people know I do show up in town hall meetings. So that's a thing. And I think that, one thing that I haven't thought through how we get to everybody that we need to get through. My first step has been to make sure that we actually have the quantitative analysis to explain what we're asking people to do. And I think that when we talk about digital inclusion, it seems like this thing like, yeah, I want digital inclusion. I want lots of people to be included. It's like, okay, but let me tell you why you need to do it now. And let me tell you how this actually affects not only what's happening, maybe let's just say you're like, oh, I'm connected. My kid's school is great. Everything's awesome. Actually, in places where students actually where you have a large homework gap, maybe you don't pay for it in terms of your student being able to participate, but maybe they actually reduce the academic rigor for everyone. And so that changes possibilities for every graduate. So when we can understand how your disconnectedness also affects my well-being, I think that we approach our solutions differently with ownership rather than otherizing people, which we're really good at. And that's really the premise of how we even count the digital divide, right? We focus on these are the households that are disconnected, when in fact, it's more like dirty water, because if there are 20 households on my block that have dirty water, yeah, it's a problem. We share piping. So I think that it's like, just making sure we have that type of paper trail of the problem, because very often creating public policy solutions starts with the actual written analysis.
Mm-hmm. So you kind of hit on the question that I was going to ask about the social return on investment and kind of how we think about the network good of this, which is like, it's that dirty water problem, right? Like this carries over into so many other things. And sorry, this was going to be a leading question, so I'm gonna stop myself. So what's the solution then? You know, okay, creating the paper trail for policy solutions, but what is the policy solution?
I don't think that there's one. I think that part of this is that number one, we need consumer-focused public policy. The reason why I walked through the history of, or at least hinted at important touch points in the history of telephone and broadband regulation, is because we're still not being completely transparent around how policies are made. I mean, quite frankly, there is a point that I make in my paper that essentially very often the people who are most disparately impacted are used in after the fact, their stories are used to justify an outcome. They are not actually used to create the solution. And so what if we actually created a situation where lots of people were actually included, we actually included their voices to come up with ideas. Like what about that? And so I don't think we do enough of that. Secondly, I think that it's okay for us to ask questions and not go into that question knowing the answer. Because I think that quite frankly, I'll even say here, I mean, I'm, you know, at Harvard, this is, and I should have mentioned this earlier, this is the original home to Massachusetts indigenous people, a place that essentially there are not a lot of people asking these questions on campus, and quite frankly, don't really understand being disconnected because they don't know people who are disconnected. So when they're giving policy advice, this is theoretical. This isn't something that changes their outcomes. They don't even know people who are impacted by that. So I don't mean to make assumptions about all people in Cambridge. What I'm pointing out is that very often the people who are in the places where policies are made, where funding decisions are made, are the most connected people, telling the disconnected people that they're purported to serve. So my point is, yes, we can make room at the table. Yes, we can ask questions about how we make policy. Yes, we can actually demand accountability when we say, this is solutions. These are the solutions. Have we gone back to assess whether or not that they're successful? And then finally, as a larger point, we can't get to this idea of having diversity in tech and doing digital, you know, diversity and belonging and including people, if we don't start with baseline giving people entryways into places where it's a universal platform. So the thing is, it's like, I have lots of different options as a connected person where I could get online and demand redress for something. I could write a letter and make sure that it's publicly, it's online for people to see for perpetuity. People who are not connected don't have those same levers of power. Yeah. And so if we acknowledge those things, I think the solutions that we come up with are different.
So powerful. And as always, so right. I know that you're going to get kicked out of your room in a minute. So I will turn this back over to you and figure out how to save those questions from the Q&A.
Oh, thank you so much, you guys. And we are going to save the questions from the Q&A. I can't wait to hear your feedback when my paper comes out in May. I'm sure that I will get lots of emails. And so there are some spicy parts, but to all of the people who supported not only my research, but pushed me to ask really hard questions, I'm so glad that I did. This is always just the beginning because there's more work to come. And if you are interested in seeing any of the videos or any of those things, I will make sure to get the entire list of everybody who participated in this webinar. But thank you again for your time and more to come. And thank you so much, Catherine, for fielding the questions in the Q&A. I appreciate you. Bye, you guys. Okay.